I never thought I'd see his name again. I was reviewing the children's school registration forms when my phone lit up with a number I'd deleted years ago. Dad flashed across the screen like an unwelcome ghost from my past. The same man who made me sleep in the garage for 3 years now wanted something from me, and I knew exactly what it was. It was a Tuesday morning, unseasonably warm for April. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows of my small apartment as I sorted through paperwork for Ethan and Zoe's upcoming school year. Single motherhood wasn't easy, but we were making it work, one day at a time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When the phone rang, I almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers usually meant bill collectors or my ex with another excuse for the missed child support. But something, curiosity, maybe, made me pick up. Hello? My voice was guarded, professional. The voice that answered was anything but. Vanessa? It's your father. 10 years. 10 years since I'd heard that voice. Since I'd walked out of that house at 18, with nothing but a duffel bag and a determination to never look back. His voice was older now, raspier, but still carried that authoritative tone that used to make me shrink whenever it rose above a whisper. I said nothing, waiting. The silence stretched between us like a physical thing. Vanessa, are you there? He sounded uncertain, almost vulnerable. An act, surely. I'm here. 2 words, neutral, giving nothing away. I need to talk to you. It's important. A pause. It's about the old property, the lake house. Of course it was. What else would make him reach out after all this time? Not to apologize for the years I spent sleeping on a cot in our uninsulated garage while my younger brother Thomas enjoyed a spacious bedroom. Not to acknowledge how he'd forgotten my birthdays and graduations. Not to explain why he'd told everyone in our small town that I was difficult when I was just a quiet kid who preferred books to his hunting trips with Thomas. What about it? I kept my tone even, betraying nothing of the sudden acceleration of my pulse. There's been some kind of mistake. The county says, they say there's development planned. That someone bought up all the surrounding acreage. They're saying we might have to sell. I glanced down at my laptop screen where I'd been reviewing the property holdings of Nightingale Preservations LLC, my conservation company that had quietly acquired every parcel around Lake Aurora over the past 5 years, including the land surrounding my father's house. That's not a mistake, I said finally. What do you mean? His voice sharpened, a flash of the old authority. Of course it is. That land's been in our family for generations. Nobody can force us to sell. I closed my laptop, not wanting my children to see what I was researching if they wandered in from their morning cartoons. Actually, they can. If the owner of all the surrounding property wants to proceed with conservation efforts. Another silence, longer this time. I could almost hear him putting it together. Vanessa, he said slowly, what have you done? What had I done? I'd worked night shifts at the hospital for 8 years while getting my environmental science degree. I'd saved every penny, lived in a studio apartment with my 2 kids after the divorce. I'd leveraged a small inheritance from my maternal grandmother into the seed money for Nightingale Preservations, named for my mother's maiden name. I'd worked tirelessly to build a company dedicated to protecting natural habitats from overdevelopment. And yes, I'd systematically purchased every parcel of land surrounding my father's property over the last 5 years. Patiently, quietly, using my mother's maiden name and investors who had no idea of my personal connection. Conservation, I answered simply. I'm doing conservation work. This is about the past, isn't it? His voice hardened. You're still upset about... I need to go. I cut him off. My children need breakfast before school. Wait. There was panic in his voice now. We need to talk about this. Your brother just moved back with his wife. This is his inheritance too. My brother Thomas, the golden child. The one who got the bedroom with the bay window while I shivered on a military surplus cot next to the lawnmower and rusting tools. The one whose college was paid for while I was told there was no money for girls' education when I earned a full scholarship. You can email me if you want to discuss the conservation project. I recited my work address mechanically. Project? This is our home. His voice cracked, and for a moment, just a moment, I felt a flicker of something. Not sympathy, exactly. Recognition, maybe. Of what it feels like when the ground shifts beneath your feet. I knew that feeling intimately. I'd experienced it at 13 when my mother died, and my father remarried within months. I felt it again when his new wife made it clear there wasn't room for me in their new family, and my father chose the path of least resistance, relegating me to the garage to give the boy his space. Nightingale Preservations will be making fair market offers to all property owners in the affected area, I said, falling back on corporate language. You'll be contacted by our acquisitions team. Vanessa, please. We're family. The word hung in the air between us. Family. As if a shared bloodline erased everything else. Goodbye, Dad. I ended the call and set the phone down carefully, like it might bite if handled roughly. My hands weren't shaking. I'd expected them to shake, but they were perfectly steady as I returned to making breakfast for my children. Mom? Who was that? Ethan appeared in the doorway, 7 years old and already too perceptive. Just work, sweetie, I said, forcing a smile. How do pancakes sound? As I mixed batter and heated the griddle, my mind kept returning to Lake Aurora. The crystalline waters where I'd learned to swim. The tall pines where I'd built secret forts. The stars reflected on the still surface at night, visible from the small garage window that had been my only connection to beauty during those 3 dark years. Lake Aurora was special, one of the last undeveloped lakes in the county, which is why I'd created Nightingale Preservations in the first place. To protect places like this from being carved up into vacation homes and tourist traps. At least that's what I told myself, but the truth was more complicated. I hadn't just chosen Lake Aurora because it was ecologically valuable. I'd chosen it because it was personal, because part of me had always known this day would come, when my father would realize that his forgotten daughter now held the power to determine the fate of his precious lakefront property. My phone buzzed, with a text. Unknown number, but I knew who it was. This isn't over. We need to talk. I'm coming to your office tomorrow. I slipped the phone into my pocket without responding. Let him come. Let him see what the girl from the garage had become. Couldn't focus on anything after the call. I went through the motions of the morning routine, getting the kids ready for school, checking their backpacks, kissing them goodbye at the bus stop. But my mind was replaying that phone call over and over. My father's voice, first controlling, then panicked, echoed in my head as I drove to the small office of Nightingale Preservations. When I arrived, my assistant Mira gave me a concerned look. You okay, Vanessa? You look like you've seen a ghost. Something like that, I murmured, heading straight for my office and closing the door. The views of the nearby creek that usually calmed me did nothing to ease the tightness in my chest. I kicked off my shoes and sank into my chair, finally allowing myself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. 10 years of carefully constructed distance, shattered by a single phone call. My hands began to shake. A delayed reaction. I hadn't expected to ever hear from him again. I'd built a life, a small but respected conservation company, a home for my children. I'd done everything possible to leave that cold garage and all it represented in the past. Yet here it was, rushing back like a flood. I could still feel the dampness that seeped through the thin mattress on rainy nights. Still taste the metallic tap water from the utility sink where I brushed my teeth. Still see my breath clouding in front of my face during winter mornings as I dressed quickly, fingers numb with cold. It builds character, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My father had said the first night, dropping a sleeping bag onto the cot. Besides, it's temporary. Just until Thomas adjusts to his new room. Temporary stretched into 3 years. 3 years of watching my belongings slowly migrate from the house to the garage. 3 years of hearing, "Keep it down out there," when I returned from school and accidentally let the garage door squeak. 3 years of pretending to friends that I had a room inside like a normal teenager. 3 years of understanding exactly where I stood in my father's hierarchy of priorities. Dead last. I opened my laptop and pulled up the Lake Aurora files. The satellite images showed it all. The blue jewel of the lake surrounded by parcels of land now highlighted in green, indicating Nightingale ownership. Only one remained red. My father's 3 acres and the house where I'd once lived, where I'd been exiled from. The logical part of me knew there were a dozen ways to address this situation professionally. We could offer above market value. We could propose a land swap for a property elsewhere. We could even modify the conservation, plan to work around his parcel, though it would compromise the overall restoration vision. But something deeper, something wounded and raw, wanted him to feel what I had felt. Powerlessness, vulnerability, the knowledge that your home isn't truly yours. My office phone buzzed. "Ms. Lockwood, there's a Dr. Elena Reyes here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's urgent. Elena." My chest tightened. "Send her in." I hadn't seen Elena in almost 2 years. Not since our relationship had ended when she took a research position across the country. She was the only person who knew the full truth about my childhood, about the garage, about my father. She was also a consulting biologist for Lake Aurora through her university position, though we'd managed to keep our interactions strictly professional and mostly via email since the breakup. The door opened, and there she was, her dark curls pulled. Back, wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose, expression serious yet soft. Her presence still had the power to knock the air from my lungs. "We need to talk," she said without preamble, closing the door behind her. "If this is about the wetlands assessment, it's about Robert Lockwood suddenly showing interest in the Lake Aurora conservation efforts," she cut me off, dropping a folder on my desk. "Your father called my department this morning. He's trying to organize opposition to the preservation project." I stared at her. "There's no real opposition to organize. He's the only holdout. He doesn't know that. He thinks there are others." She sat down uninvited. "He has no idea you're behind Nightingale, does he?" I shook my head slightly. "Not until today. And even now, he might not have put it all together." Elena's eyes softened with something dangerous. Compassion, maybe. Understanding. The last things I needed right now. "Vanessa, what are you doing?" "When you started this project, you said it was about preserving a critical watershed and protecting endangered wildlife. You said nothing about it being on your father's doorstep." "It's not about him," I insisted too quickly. "Lake Aurora is perfect for this project. The ecosystem, the biodiversity, the undisturbed shoreline." Stop. Just one word, but it silenced me instantly. Elena had always been able to see through my defenses. "When were you going to tell me that this whole project is within walking distance of where you grew up, where they made you sleep in that garage?" The direct mention of the garage felt like a physical blow. Nobody talked about it. Not even me. "It's irrelevant," I said, my voice tight. "This is about conservation." "Is it?" Elena leaned forward. "Because, from where I'm sitting, it looks an awful lot like revenge. You don't understand. I understand perfectly." Her voice was gentle now, which somehow made it worse. "You're the girl who was kicked out of her own home, who fought her way through college as a single mother, who swore you'd show them all. And now you have the power to take everything from the man who hurt you most. I looked away, unable to meet her gaze. The project has scientific merit. I'm sure it does. You're too smart to pursue something that doesn't. She opened the folder she'd brought, pushing a document toward me. But there are 50 other wetlands within a 100-mile radius that would benefit just as much from protection. This isn't about science, Vanessa. It's about that garage. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken truths. He called me, I finally admitted. Today, after 10 years of nothing, he called because he needs something. Elena's expression softened further. And how did that make you feel? The professional mask I'd worn slipped. Vindicated, I whispered. Angry. Satisfied. Sick. I ran a hand over my face. All of it. All at once. She nodded, unsurprised. And what are you going to do now? I stared at the conservation plans on my desk, at the areas marked for restoration and protection, including the shoreline where my father's house stood. I don't know, I admitted. But he's coming here tomorrow. He wants to talk. Elena stood, gathering her folder. Then I guess you have until tomorrow to decide what this is really about. Healing the lake's ecosystem, or healing that girl in the garage. She paused at the door. Just remember, Vanessa, the decisions you make now will define you far longer than that garage ever did. After she left, I sat motionless, her words ringing in my ears. Outside my office window, a heron landed, gracefully on the creek bank, reminding me of why I'd fallen in love with environmental conservation in the first place, long before revenge against my father had entered the equation. I left the office late that night, driving aimlessly through the city streets before finding myself on the highway heading north, toward Lake Aurora. I hadn't planned to go there, but some magnetic pull drew me back to the place that had shaped me, for better and worse. 90 minutes later, I turned onto the familiar gravel road that circled the lake. In the moonlight, the water looked like polished obsidian, reflecting the stars above. I parked at the old boat launch, now owned by Nightingale Preservations, and killed the engine. The silence was immediate and complete. No traffic noise, no city hum. Just frogs, the occasional splash of a fish, and my own breathing. I got out and walked to the edge of the water, letting memories wash over me. This exact spot, had been my sanctuary as a teenager. I'd come here to escape the humiliation of the garage, the coldness of my father's new family, the whispers at school. The lake never judged, never excluded, never made me feel unwelcome. My phone buzzed in my pocket. For a wild moment, I thought it might be my father again, but the screen showed a different name. Sarah Liu, my financial director. Sarah, it's late. What's going on? Sorry to bother you, Vanessa, but I thought you should know. Someone's been making inquiries about our Lake Aurora acquisitions. I tensed. What kind of inquiries? Detailed ones. Property records, purchase prices, holding companies. They've been contacting county officials, title companies, even some of our donors. My father? No. Sarah hesitated. A man named Thomas Lockwood. He identified himself as an interested party. Thomas, my brother, the golden child, now searching for information about the Lake Aurora project. The pieces clicked into place. My father must have called him after our conversation. They were working together. How much did they find out? Nothing they couldn't get from public records. The shell companies are secure. They can't trace them back to Nightingale yet, let alone to you personally. But they're digging, Vanessa. They know something's off about how all those properties were acquired by different entities within months of each other. I stared across the dark water, calculating. Thanks for the heads up. Let's accelerate the timeline. I want all properties formally transferred to Nightingale's name by end of week. That will tip our hand completely. Everyone will know Nightingale controls nearly the entire lakefront. That's fine. It's time anyway. After hanging up, I remained at the water's edge, thinking about what I'd just set in motion. Once the transfers were complete, there would be no more hiding behind shell companies and separate donors. Everyone would know that Nightingale, that I, controlled Lake Aurora's destiny. 5 years ago, when I first conceived of this project, I'd established 5 different conservation trusts to quietly acquire the parcels. Different names, different structures, different addresses, a complex web designed to hide the fact that one entity was systematically buying up the entire lake. I created Heron Trust first, named for the birds that had nested at the lake for generations. Through Heron, I purchased the old Williams property, on the North Shore, 200 acres of untouched forest with half a mile of pristine waterfront. Next came Watershed Alliance, which acquired the abandoned summer camp on the East Shore. Then Clearwater Initiative for the farmland on the western edge. Lockwood Environmental Fund, a deliberate choice using my own surname, almost daring someone to make the connection, for several smaller parcels along the southern rim. One by one. Piece by piece, I reconstructed the boundaries of my childhood world. Every acquisition funded through grants and conservation-minded donors, every property purchased at fair market value or above. No strong arming, no underhanded tactics. Just science-based conservation, conducted methodically and legally. But Sarah was right. There was a pattern that an observant person might notice. And Thomas, for all his faults, had always been observant. My phone buzzed again, a text from an unknown number. "Vanessa, it's Thomas. We need to talk. Dad told me what's happening." I almost laughed. Of course he would find my number. Of course he would text instead of call. Thomas always preferred to have things in writing. I didn't respond. What was there to say? "Sorry, your inheritance is being threatened? Sorry the house you got to sleep in while I froze in the garage might be surrounded by protected wetlands? Sorry your father's poor treatment of me has come back to haunt him?" Instead, I pocketed my phone and walked along the shore, letting my feet find the familiar path. In the distance, barely visible in the darkness, stood my father's house, my childhood home. A single light burned in what had been the kitchen window. Was he there now, pacing the floor, planning his approach for tomorrow's meeting? Or was Thomas there too, the two of them strategizing how to stop the mysterious conservationist who threatened their legacy? They had no idea who they were really fighting against. I found myself at the edge of my father's property line. Just beyond the rusting fence stood the detached garage, my bedroom for 3 long years. In the moonlight, it looked smaller than I remembered. The windows were dark, the sliding door partially open. Had it always been so dilapidated? So obviously inadequate as a living space for a child? Movement caught my eye, a flashlight beam bobbing inside the garage. Someone was in there. I crouched instinctively, watching as the light swept across the interior space. The beam settled, illuminating a figure bent over something on the far wall. As my eyes adjusted, I realized it was my father. What was he doing in the garage at this hour? I crept closer, staying in the shadows. Through the partially open door, I could see him more clearly now. He was examining the far wall where I'd kept my makeshift desk, just a piece of plywood stretched across 2 plastic crates. He ran his hand over the wall, then tapped it in, several places before using a pocket knife to pry at something. With a soft crack, a small section of the wallboard came loose. He reached into the opening and withdrew something, holding it up to his flashlight. My breath caught. It was my mother's field journal, her naturalist's notebook filled with observations of Lake Aurora's ecosystem, sketches of local wildlife, and her passionate arguments for preserving the lake's delicate balance. I'd hidden it in that wall after her death, terrified my father and his new wife would throw it away with the rest of her clutter. I'd forgotten all about it when I left at 18, too eager to escape to remember the treasures I'd concealed. How did he know it was there? He turned the pages gently, his shoulders shaking slightly. Was he crying? Before I could process this, a car door slammed in the distance. The sound startled both of us. My father quickly tucking the journal inside his jacket and switching off his flashlight, me ducking deeper into the shadows as headlights swept across the property. A car pulled up to the main house, and Thomas emerged, his silhouette unmistakable even after all these years. "Dad?" he called out. "Where are you? I found something about those companies buying up the lake." I barely slept that night. The image of my father holding my mother's journal kept replaying in my mind. By dawn, I'd given up on rest and was already at my office, reviewing the lake. Aurora files with fresh eyes. The early morning light cast long shadows across my small office as I spread out the oldest documents: wildlife surveys from 5 years ago, initial wetland assessments, funding proposals. I traced the outline of the lake with my finger, remembering how I'd first pitched the project to potential donors. A pristine ecosystem with endangered species and critical watershed functions, I'd told them. The perfect example of why we need to protect our remaining natural habitats. I hadn't mentioned my personal connection. Hadn't told them that I'd learned to swim in those waters, that I'd cataloged wildflowers along its shore with my mother, that the tall pine on the north bank still had the remnants of a fort I'd built. When I was 10, I certainly hadn't told them about the garage. My assistant arrived at 7:30, surprised to find me already there. "You're in early, Ms. Lockwood," she said, setting a coffee on my desk. "Big day," I replied, not looking up from the maps. "Can you pull all the ownership records for the Lake Aurora properties? I want everything in one file before my 10 a.m. Your 10 a.m. isn't on the calendar," she noted, checking her tablet. "It's a personal meeting. My father." She paused, clearly surprised. In 3 years working for me, I'd never once mentioned my father. "I'll have the files ready. Anything else?" "Call Sarah. I want her here for the meeting too." After she left, I unlocked my desk drawer and removed a small leather-bound book, a copy of my mother's field journal. I'd managed to recreate portions of it from memory over the years, supplemented with my own observations. I'd assumed the original was long gone, destroyed or discarded after her death. But now, I flipped to an entry I knew by heart, dated 3 months before her death. "Robert is distant again. Working late, he says, but I wonder. He's been this way since the argument about the lake property. His business partner wants to develop it, and Robert agrees. It's just swampland," he told me. "Worthless without development." But it's not. Just swampland to me. It's where I conducted my research, where my daughter learns about nature, where I find peace. I've begged him to understand that some ecosystems have value beyond dollars. He doesn't see it. Maybe he never will. I closed the journal, my mother's insight striking me anew. My father and his business partner had wanted to develop the lake. My mother had fought to preserve it, and now here I was, the conservationist. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. At precisely 10 a.m., my assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Ms. Lockwood, your father is here." I took a deep breath, straightening my blazer. "Send him in." The door opened, and there he stood, Robert Lockwood, 20 pounds lighter. Then I remembered, hair now completely gray, the lines around his mouth deeper. But his eyes were the same, calculating, assessing, looking for advantage. "Vanessa." He nodded stiffly. "Dad." The word felt foreign in my mouth. "Please, sit." He took the chair across from my desk, eyes darting around the office, taking in the conservation awards on the wall, the framed photo of my children, the subtle indicators of my modest success. "Nice place," he said finally. "You've done well. For yourself." "Thank you." I kept my tone neutral. "I understand you wanted to discuss Lake Aurora." He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Let's cut to the chase. You're behind this preservation project, all of it. The company's buying up the shore, the conservation plans, everything. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. Yes. He nodded slowly, as if confirming a suspicion. And you intentionally kept me in the dark. Let me find out only when it was too late to do anything about it. I didn't hide anything. All acquisitions were public record, under different company. Names, he scoffed. Shell organizations. Thomas figured it out last night. They all trace back to you eventually. I raised an eyebrow, impressed despite myself. Thomas must have worked through the night to unravel the organizational structure. The point remains, I said evenly, that Nightingale Preservations now controls 97% of the Lake Aurora shoreline, all legally purchased. Except my property. His jaw tightened. The house where you grew up. The house, I corrected him, not the garage. The words hung between us, the first direct reference to what we both knew but had never discussed. His face flushed, but before he could respond, there was a knock at the door. Sarah entered, perfectly timed. Sorry I'm late, she said, though she wasn't. We'd planned this interruption. Dad, this is Sarah Liu, Nightingale's financial director. Sarah, my father, Robert Lockwood. She nodded coolly, taking the seat beside him. Mr. Lockwood, I've prepared some numbers I think you'll want to see. She opened a folder and placed a document on the desk between us. This is our offer for your property. As you can see, it's significantly above market value. My father glanced at the figure and his eyes widened slightly. It was generous, twice what the property was worth. This isn't about money, he said, but his tone lacked conviction. It's always about money, I replied. At least, that's what you taught me. Sarah slid another document forward. Option 2. We redesign the conservation area to work around your property. You keep your house, but you'll be subject to strict ecological regulations regarding shoreline use, runoff, and wildlife disturbance. My father frowned, considering. There's a third option, I continued. We abandon the project entirely. Walk away. The lake stays exactly as it is. Sarah shot me a startled look. This wasn't part of our discussion. I ignored her. What's the catch? My father asked, suspicious. You tell me why you were in the garage last night. His face went pale. You were there, watching me? I was at the lake. I saw you find Mom's journal in the wall. How did you know it was there? He looked away, jaw working. You hid all sorts of things in that wall. I found the loose panel years ago when I was rewiring the garage. Found your stash, novels, candy wrappers, that diary you kept. My stomach dropped. You read my diary? Just enough to know you hated me. His voice had lost its edge, sounding almost resigned. Enough to know you blamed me for putting you in the garage, for choosing Karen and Thomas over you. And did I have reason to blame you? I asked quietly. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, to my shock, he nodded. Yes. The single word seemed to deflate him. He suddenly looked older, smaller in the modern office chair. After your mother died, I couldn't, he began, then stopped. Started again. Every time I looked at you, I saw her. Same passion for that lake, same stubborn idealism. It hurt too much. Karen said it would be easier if we had separation. The garage was her idea, but I went along with it. For 3 years, I said. For 3 years, he echoed. Too long. Far too long. Sarah cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable with the personal turn of the conversation. Should I give you two a moment? No, my father said abruptly. I want to understand the deal on the table. My house for the journal? Is that it? I shook my head. The journal is mine. Mom wanted me to have it. I want to know why you care about it now, after all these years. He reached into his jacket and pulled it out. The worn leather notebook with my mother's flowing script. In the office light, the pages seemed to glow with an inner life. Because it was the only thing I had left of her. he said simply. Of who she was before the arguments, before I stopped listening. The pattern of the past stretched between us, decades of hurt and misunderstanding condensed into this single moment. And for the first time, I wondered if there might be more to the story than I had allowed myself to see. Before the arguments, I repeated, the words hanging in the air between us. Before you stopped listening to her about the lake? My father flinched, his fingers closing around the journal. It wasn't that simple, Vanessa. It seemed pretty simple to me at 13. Mom dies, you remarry within months, and suddenly I'm sleeping next to the lawnmower while your new wife redecorates my bedroom for her son. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I really should give you two some privacy for this. Stay, I said firmly. This conversation needed a witness, someone who would remember what was said when doubt inevitably crept back in later. You're here as Nightingale's financial director. This affects the project. My father's eyes narrowed. Is that what this is really about? The project? Or is it about punishing me? The question hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. Until yesterday, I would have quickly denied any personal motivation. Lake Aurora was an ecologically significant wetland habitat, nothing more. But seeing him in the garage, holding my mother's journal, had shaken that certainty. Why don't you tell me what it's about? I countered. You're the one who came here after 10 years of silence. What do you really want? He set the journal on the desk between us, his hand trembling, slightly. I want to understand why my daughter is trying to force me out of my home. It's just conservation, I said, throwing his own philosophy back at him. It's just swampland, worthless without proper ecological management. Isn't that what you told Mom? His head snapped up. How did you— Her journal. I tapped my desk, drawer where my recreated copy lay. She wrote about the arguments you had, about how your business partner wanted to develop the lake, how you agreed with him. A shadow crossed his face. She never understood. Jackson was leveraged to the hilt. The lake development was his only way out of debt. If he'd built those vacation homes when he wanted to, we could have paid off the business loans, saved the construction company. But your mother— He shook his head. She was idealistic, wanted to preserve the lake at all costs. And now? I asked. What would she think of me preserving it? His eyes met mine, surprisingly direct. She'd be proud. But she'd wonder about your methods. And what are my methods, Dad? Using conservation as a weapon. He gestured around my office. You've built all this, become successful beyond anything I ever achieved. But that wasn't enough, was it? You needed to come back and show me, show everyone, that you control the very land I refuse to protect. The accuracy of his assessment hit me like a physical blow. I'd never articulated it so clearly, even to myself. But he was right. Lake Aurora wasn't just a conservation project. It was a statement, a reclaiming of territory that had been taken from me. Sarah cleared her throat. The project does have substantial scientific merit beyond any personal considerations, Mr. Lockwood. The lake supports 3 endangered species. The wetlands provide critical flood control for the region. It's an environmentally significant site. I'm sure it is, my father acknowledged, not taking his eyes off me. Vanessa was always thorough, but that doesn't change the fact that of all the wetlands, all the ecosystems, all the conservation projects she could have chosen, she picked the one place guaranteed to hurt me most. The room fell silent. Sarah looked at me, clearly waiting, for a denial I couldn't honestly provide. You hurt me first, I said quietly. My father didn't dispute this. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded envelope, placing it beside the journal on my desk. What's this? I asked, not touching it. The real reason I came. Open it. Cautiously, I took the envelope. Inside was a medical report with my father's name at the top. I scanned the document, medical terms jumping out at me. Stage 3, metastasized, treatment options limited, prognosis 6 to 12 months. My eyes snapped back to my father's face, seeing now what I had missed before. The weight loss wasn't just age, the pallor wasn't just poor sleep, the fatigue in his eyes wasn't just stress. "You're dying," I said, the words flat in the suddenly airless room. He nodded once. "Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed 3 months ago." Sarah stood abruptly. "I'll give you some privacy," she said, and this time I didn't stop her. She gathered her papers and left, closing the door softly behind her. I stared at my father. This man I had spent a decade hating, now transformed into something else, something mortal, vulnerable, finite. "Why tell me?" I asked finally. "You could have sold the property, taken the money, enjoyed your last months without ever seeing me again." "Because there's more you need to know," he said. "About the garage, about everything." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "After your mother died, I fell apart. The drinking, the hasty marriage to Karen, those were symptoms, not solutions. I was drowning, Vanessa. And then one night, I went to the lake, read your mother's final journal entries about how I'd betrayed her vision, nearly drove my truck into the water in despair. I remembered finding him passed out on the shore that night, the truck's wheels just feet from the water's edge. The doctors called it a breakdown," he continued. "Said I needed to create a stable environment at home. Karen was afraid, not just for herself and Thomas, but for you. You were so much like your mother, so passionate about the lake. She thought, you'd be better off separate." My hands gripped the armrests of my chair. "What are you saying?" "The garage wasn't just Karen's idea. It was the therapist's suggestion, too. Create clear boundaries in the home until the family system stabilizes. I didn't want you to see me like that, to watch me fall apart. The garage seemed safer." "For 3 years?" I asked incredulously. He shook his head. "The first few months were about my mental health. The rest?" He looked away. "The rest was cowardice. The breakdown passed, but by then patterns were established. Karen had made the house hers. You had made the garage yours. And I didn't know how to fix any of it without admitting how broken I was." I sat back, trying to process this new information. The idea that the garage had initially been for my protection, not my exile, shifted something fundamental in my understanding of those years. "Why didn't you ever tell me this? Would you have believed me?" he asked. "Or would you have seen it as just another excuse?" He had a point. The teenager I'd been would have rejected any explanation. The adult I'd become had built an identity. Around that rejection, I looked down at the medical report again. 6 to 12 months. Maybe less now. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Forgiveness?" "No," he said, surprising me. "Understanding, maybe. But mostly, I want to die in my house. By the lake. The house where your mother lived. Where you were born." He met my eyes directly. "I'm asking you to let me have that. Modify your conservation plan until after I'm gone. It won't be long." The brutal simplicity of his request cut through years of complex resentment. He wasn't fighting for financial gain or future advantage. He was fighting for the right to end his life in the place it had meaning. I looked at the journal still lying on the desk between us. My mother's passionate defense of Lake Aurora captured in her neat handwriting. What would she advise me to do now? Preserve the ecosystem at all costs? Or recognize that sometimes conservation must account for human needs too? In that moment, with the sunlight streaming through my office windows and my father's mortality laid bare before me, everything shifted. The past remained unchanged, but my perception of it, the meaning I had assigned to each painful memory, suddenly seemed incomplete, a child's understanding of adult complexities. I picked up my mother's journal, feeling its worn leather cover beneath my fingertips. The pages still held her scent somehow. Wildflowers and lake water, the essence of who she'd been. "I need time to think," I said finally, neither accepting nor rejecting his request. My father nodded, looking relieved even at this non-commitment. "That's fair. You can stay in the city? I'll need a day or two." "I'm at the Lakeview Inn, room 312. He stood slowly, his movements careful in a way I hadn't noticed before. "Thomas doesn't know about the diagnosis. No one does, except my doctors. I'd appreciate if you kept it that way for now." I nodded, slightly surprised he'd trust me with this confidence. "I'll walk you out." We moved through the office in silence, passing curious staff who tried not to stare. I could only imagine what they were thinking. The mysterious father of the boss, appearing after years with no mention. At the elevator, my father hesitated, then pulled something else from his pocket. A small key. "For the trunk in the garage," he explained. "There's more of your mother's things in there. Research notes she made about the lake's ecosystem. Some photos, things she wanted you to have that I kept from you." I took the key, feeling a complex surge of emotions. Anger at what had been withheld, gratitude for its return now, confusion over how to process any of it. "Why now?" I asked. "Why not years ago?" His eyes, so like mine, I suddenly realized, met mine directly. "Because I was selfish. Because I wanted to keep her memory to myself. Because I thought I had time to find the right moment." He shrugged slightly. "All the worst reasons." The elevator arrived, and he stepped in, turning to face me as the doors began to close. "Whatever you decide about the property, Vanessa, I hope someday you can forgive me, not for my sake, but for yours." The doors shut before I could respond, leaving me standing there, key in one hand, journal in the other, feeling strangely unmoored. Back in my office, I closed the door and leaned against it, trying to sort through the tangled mess of revelations. The garage had started as protection, not punishment. My father had been unwell, not just cruel. My mother's conservation work was more extensive than I'd realized. None of it erased the cold nights, the isolation, the years of feeling unwanted in my own home. But it complicated the narrative I'd built my adult life around, the story of a callous father who discarded his daughter without a second thought. I returned to my desk and called Sarah back in. "Are you all right?" she asked, studying my face with concern. "I need you to examine our options," I said, ignoring her question. "What happens to the Lake Aurora project if we leave my father's parcel untouched? Not just working around it, leaving it completely independent." She frowned, professional concern overtaking personal. "We'd need to reconfigure the entire central buffer zone. The wildlife corridor would have to be relocated to the North Shore, which means reconfiguring the restoration plan, the educational trails, the monitoring stations. It's possible, but it would delay implementation by at least 6 months and add considerable cost." "How much?" "Preliminary estimate? 50 to 70,000. Plus lost grant opportunities if we miss the seasonal planting window." I nodded, absorbing this. "And what if we delay the entire project by a year? Keep the current design but push the timeline?" Sarah's eyebrows shot up. "A year? The funding implications would be substantial. We'd risk losing our foundation grants. Our permits would need renewal, and the landowners who sold to us with conservation easements might question our commitment. Could we overcome those challenges?" "Of course, but we've spent months building credibility with these stakeholders. Starting over means new applications, new relationship building. Honestly, Vanessa, what's going on? This morning we were accelerating. The timeline? And now you're talking about a year's delay?" I set the journal on my desk, staring at my mother's handwriting on its cover. "My father is dying. Pancreatic cancer. 6 to 12 months. Sarah's professional demeanor softened immediately. I'm sorry, Vanessa. I didn't realize. Neither did I until 20 minutes ago. I took a deep breath. He wants to die in his home. He's asking me to delay the project until after he's gone. Understanding dawned in her eyes. And you're considering it? I'm considering all options. I need you to give me concrete numbers, exact costs for each scenario. Delay, redesign, or proceed as planned. She nodded, already making notes. I can have preliminary figures by tomorrow morning. But Vanessa, the board members, I'll handle the board, I cut in. Just get me the numbers. After she left, I sat at my desk for a long time, turning the journal's pages, reading my mother's passionate pleas for Lake Aurora's protection. Then I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in nearly 2 years. Elena Reyes. It's Vanessa. I need your help. A pause. This is unexpected. I know, but you're the only one who understands the full context. I hesitated. Can you meet me at Lake Aurora tonight? The old boat launch. Another pause, longer this time. Why? Because I'm making a decision that will affect the entire project, and I need your perspective. This sounds suspiciously like you're asking for my personal input, not my professional assessment. Maybe I am, she sighed, but I could hear the rustle of papers, the sound of her clearing her schedule. 6 o'clock. Don't be late. I spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing the Lake Aurora files with new eyes. The species inventories, the wetland delineations, the restoration plans. All of it seemed different now, colored by the new understanding of my connection to this place. At 5, I left the office and drove north toward the lake, stopping to pick up dinner from the small vegetarian cafe where Elena and I had often eaten during our relationship. The owner recognized me, raising an eyebrow at the 2 orders but saying nothing. The boat launch was empty when I arrived, the evening sun casting long shadows across the water. I spread a blanket on the worn wooden dock and set out the food, feeling oddly nervous. Elena arrived precisely at 6, her hybrid car crunching on. The gravel. She approached cautiously, eyeing the picnic setup with suspicion. This isn't a date, Vanessa, she said by way of greeting. It's dinner. I thought we might be here a while. I gestured to the space beside me. Your favorite. Mushroom risotto from Mira's. She sat, still wary, but accepted the container. So, what's changed since yesterday? I told her everything. My father's visit, his medical diagnosis, the truth. About the garage, the revelation about my mother's comprehensive research on Lake Aurora. Elena listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from skepticism to something more complex. That's a lot to process, she said when I finished. Tell me about it. I stared out at the lake, watching a family of ducks glide across the water. I've spent 10 years hating him, Elena. Built my whole identity around proving him wrong about the lake, about conservation, about me. And now? Now it's more complicated, she finished for me. But Vanessa, this new information doesn't invalidate your experience. Whatever his reasons, you still spent 3 years in that garage. You were still a child who felt abandoned. I nodded, grateful for her understanding. The question is what I do now. Sarah's running the numbers on delaying or redesigning the project. But I need your opinion on something else. Elena set her food aside, giving me her full attention. Mother fought to preserve this lake, I said quietly. She argued with my father and his business partner about protecting it, and I've been carrying on that fight, but now I wonder if I've been doing it the right way. The gravel driveway crunched under my tires as I pulled up to the house, keeping my headlights off. I hadn't called ahead, wasn't even sure if anyone was home. Part of me hoped the place would be empty, allowing me to explore the garage without confrontation. No such luck. A light glowed in the kitchen window, and as I cut the engine, a silhouette appeared in the doorway. Not my father's gaunt frame, but a broader figure I recognized immediately. Thomas. I sat in the car for a long moment considering retreat. But the front door opened, spilling yellow light across the porch, and my brother stepped out, shielding his eyes to peer at my vehicle. "Who's there?" he called, his voice carrying across the yard. I opened the car door and stepped out. "It's me." Even in the dim light, I could see his posture stiffen. "Vanessa? What are you doing here?" "I need to check something in the garage," I said, walking toward him. "Dad gave me a key." He folded his arms, blocking the path to the side yard. "At 9 o'clock at night? Without calling first?" Up close, Thomas looked older than I'd expected. Lines around his eyes, his once athletic frame slightly softer. He'd been just a child when I left, barely 8. Now he was a man in his late 20s, with a wedding ring on his finger and a defensive posture that spoke volumes. "I didn't think I needed permission to visit the property I'm about to own," I said, immediately regretting the antagonism in my tone. His eyes flashed. "So that's how it's going to be? You disappear for a decade, then swoop in with some conservation scheme to take our home." "Your home," I corrected. "Never mine. I had the garage, remember?" Something shifted in his expression, not quite guilt, but recognition. "I was a kid, Vanessa. I didn't make that decision." "No, your mother did. And our father went along with it." We stood in stalemate, years of unspoken history stretching between us. Finally, Thomas sighed. "Dad's not here. He went to the city yesterday and hasn't come back. Mom left years ago, ran off with her personal trainer when I was in college." A hint of bitterness tinged his words. "It's just me and Julie here now." "Temporarily," I nodded, absorbing this information. "I'm not here to fight, Thomas. Dad gave me something that belongs to me, and I need to retrieve it." "In the garage?" "Yes." He studied me for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Fine. It's unlocked." I walked past him, following the familiar path around the house to the detached structure where I'd spent 3 formative years. The garage door was slightly ajar, just as it had been the night before when I'd watched my father retrieve the journal. "Do you need a light?" Thomas called, still standing on the porch. "I know my way around," I answered, pushing the door open. The interior was dark, but as my eyes adjusted, familiar shapes emerged from the shadows. The workbench along the back wall, the shelving units to the left, the empty space where my cot had once stood. Someone had finally organized the garden supplies that had always been scattered across the floor during my time here, arranging them neatly on metal shelving. I ran my hand along the wall, finding the light switch exactly where I remembered. The single bulb illuminated the space in harsh yellow light, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The garage was cleaner now, more orderly, but essentially unchanged. The same cracks ran across the floor, the same water stains spread like a continent on the ceiling. The air still smelled of soil and fertilizer and forgotten dreams. I moved to the back wall, to the spot where I'd hidden the journal. The section my father had pried open was still loose, the small cavity behind it visible. But I wasn't interested in that hiding place now. I turned to the far corner, crouching to examine a large wooden trunk. It had been my mother's field equipment container, repurposed as my own secret storage when I discovered the lock was broken and could be jammed shut to look secure. The key fit perfectly, turning with a well-oiled click. I lifted the lid, surprised to find it wasn't filled with garden tools as it had been when I lived here. Instead, it contained carefully organized files and notebooks, decades of my mother's research on Lake Aurora. With trembling fingers, I removed the topmost folder. Inside were survey maps, handwritten species counts, water quality analyses from the years before my birth. Beneath it lay more files, all meticulously labeled in my mother's handwriting. Migratory bird patterns, amphibian habitats, native plant communities. This was her life's work, a comprehensive ecological study of Lake Aurora spanning decades. Work I had only glimpsed fragments of as a child, when she would take me on research adventures around the lake. Find what you were looking for? I looked up to see Thomas standing in the doorway, 2 mugs in his hands. Did you know about this? I asked, gesturing to the trunk. He frowned, stepping inside and offering me one of the mugs. Know about what? Mom's research. All of it. She documented everything about the lake's ecosystem. Years of work. Thomas set his mug down on the workbench and knelt beside me, peering into the trunk. I had no idea. Dad never mentioned it. I pulled out another folder, this one containing newspaper clippings about proposed developments around the lake, each with my mother's annotations in the margins. Opposition strategy notes. Contact information for environmental attorneys. The beginning of a legal brief arguing for protected status. She wasn't just studying the lake, I said quietly. She was building a case to protect it. Against Dad's business partner, Thomas added, picking up a letter. This is from Jackson Miller to Dad, dated a month before Mom died. He's threatening to dissolve their partnership if Dad doesn't convince Mom to drop her opposition to the development. I stared at my brother, seeing understanding dawn in his expression. Dad was caught in the middle. Between his business and Mom's conservation work, I confirmed. We continued exploring the trunk's contents in silence, brothers and sister momentarily, united in discovering a mother we had both lost, though I had been old enough to remember her, while Thomas had been only a toddler when she died. Was she kind? He asked suddenly, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. The question caught me off guard, so similar to what I might have asked about our father if our situations were reversed. Very. She laughed all the time, taught me the names of every bird at the lake, made up silly songs about tadpoles and dragonflies. Thomas smiled faintly, clearly trying to construct a mental image from my description. Dad never talks about her, Mom, Karen, forbade any mention of her in the house. I know, I said, remembering the family photos that had disappeared, the books that had been packed away, the careful excision of Catherine Lockwood from family narratives. At the bottom of the trunk lay a sealed envelope with my name written on it. I opened it with care, finding a letter dated just weeks before her death. My dearest Vanessa, if you're reading this, I've entrusted your father to give you my research when you're old enough to understand it. The lake is precious beyond measure, not just for its beauty, but for the complex web of life it supports. I've dedicated my career to documenting it, and now I pass this torch to you. Protect it. But remember that we protect nature not by standing against people, but by helping them see what we see. Your father sees the lake differently than we do, but his view is not without merit. There must be balance between preservation and human needs. With all my love, Mommy sat back on my heels, the letter trembling in my hands. What does it say? Thomas asked quietly. I couldn't speak, could only pass him the letter. He read it silently, then handed it back. She knew, he said. Even then, she knew you'd follow in her footsteps. I nodded, unable to articulate the complex emotions swirling within me. Pride that my mother had seen my path so clearly, grief that she hadn't lived to guide me along it, and a growing uneasiness about how I'd chosen to pursue that path. Not through education and persuasion as she had advocated, but through financial leverage and legal maneuvering. I need to take these, I said finally, gesturing to the trunk. Study them properly. Thomas nodded. They're yours. They were always meant for you. As I began carefully packing the materials, he watched thoughtfully. What will you do about the conservation project? About Dad's house? I don't know yet, I admitted. But I need to go back to the beginning. Understand what my mother was really trying to accomplish. What she would want me to do now. For the first time in years, I was laying groundwork for a decision based not on revenge, but on a more nuanced truth. One that honored not just the lake, but the complex human relationships connected to it. Thomas helped me load the trunk into My car, the weight of decades worth of research requiring both of us to lift it. As we closed the trunk, an awkward silence fell between us. The kind that emerges when strangers who should be family try to navigate unfamiliar terrain. Your kids, he said finally. How old are they now? Ethan is 7, Zoe is 5. I leaned against my car, surprised by his interest. How did you know I have children? A faint smile crossed his face. Dad has pictures, on his desk in the study. This revelation caught me off guard. Pictures? How? I've never sent him any. He follows your conservation organization online. You post photos sometimes of community events with your kids. He prints them. I didn't know how to respond to this information. The idea that my father had been collecting glimpses of my life, of my children's lives, from afar. That he had cared enough to do so, but not enough to reach out directly. Until now. Would you like to come in? Thomas asked, gesturing toward the house. Julie's making tea. Your kids are with their father? No, with my neighbor. I should get back. I hesitated, then added, another time maybe. He nodded, understanding this was as much as I could offer right now. Vanessa, for what it's worth, I didn't know. About the garage? Not really. I was young, and they told me you preferred it. That you liked having your own space. I studied. My brother's face, the earnest expression, the hint of the little boy I barely knew beneath the adult features. You were a child, Thomas. It wasn't your fault. As I drove back to the city, my phone rang. Elena. Did you find what you were looking for? She asked. We had parted at the lake after dinner, her encouraging me to visit the garage tonight rather, then waiting. More than I expected, I replied, and told her about the trunk, the research, the letter. This changes things, she said when I finished. Your mother was building a scientific and legal case for the lake's protection. You have the foundation for a much stronger conservation approach now. I know, but I also have her words telling. Me, that protection isn't about standing against people, but bringing them along. I'm not sure I've been doing that. What will you do? I don't know yet, I admitted. But I need to read through all her research first. Understand what she documented, what she was fighting for specifically. After hanging up, I drove the rest of the way in silence, my mind working through the implications of everything I'd learned. By the time I reached my apartment, it was past midnight. My neighbor Sandra was dozing on my couch, the TV playing. Quietly, they went to bed around 9, she whispered as I thanked her and walked her to the door. Ethan said to tell you he finished his library book and needs a new one. After she left, I checked on my children, standing in their doorway and watching their peaceful sleep. Ethan had kicked off his covers as usual, one arm flung dramatically over his head. Zoe was curled into a tight ball, clutching her stuffed otter. My heart swelled with love for them, these extensions of myself who had never known the pain of exile, who had always been at the center of my world rather than its periphery. I carried the first box of my mother's research into my small home office and began organizing the materials, too keyed up to sleep. The systematic approach she had taken impressed me. Seasonal surveys, water quality testing, species counts, all methodically documented over years. This wasn't just the work of an amateur nature enthusiast. This was professional-level ecological research. Around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from my father. Did you find the trunk? I should have given it to you years ago. I'm sorry. I stared at the message, uncertain how to respond. The simple acknowledgement of his wrongdoing was something I had never expected to receive. Before I could decide whether to answer, another text arrived. Whatever you decide about the property, I need you to know I'm proud of what you've built. The conservation work, the family, all of it. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Finally, I typed, I found it. We'll talk tomorrow. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the events of the past 2 days. The unexpected phone call from my father, the confrontation in my office, the revelation of his illness, the discovery of my mother's research, the trunk that should have been given to me years ago. The anticipation of tomorrow's decision weighed heavily on me. I could move forward with the conservation plan as designed, forcing my father to sell in his final months. I could delay the project entirely, waiting until after he was gone. Or I could find some middle path, one that honored both my mother's scientific legacy and her philosophical approach. At 6 a.m., I gave up on sleep and went back to the research materials. In a folder labeled Compromise Solutions, I found a proposal my mother had drafted shortly before her death. A plan that designated critical habitat areas for strict preservation, while allowing limited, environmentally sensitive human access in other zones. A balanced approach that recognized the lake belonged to both the ecosystem and the community. I was still studying it when Ethan padded into the room, rubbing his eyes sleepily. "Mommy, why are you up so early?" I pulled him onto my lap, breathing in the sweet scent of his hair. "I'm learning about the work your grandmother did. She was a scientist who studied the lake where I grew up." "The lake in the pictures?" he asked, pointing to a framed photo on my desk. One of the few I had of my mother and me at Lake Aurora, both of us laughing as we examined something in a tide pool. "That's right. She loved that lake very much, and she worked hard to protect it." "Just like you do with all the wetlands and forests," he said with the simple clarity of a child. "Just like that," I agreed, though the parallel wasn't quite so straightforward. My mother had sought protection through education and compromise. I had sought it through acquisition and control. By the time Zoe woke up and the morning routine began, breakfast made, clothes selected, backpacks packed, I had reached a tentative decision. Not one based on hurt or revenge or even strict ecological priorities, but one that attempted to honor all the complex threads of this situation. As I dropped the children at school, my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Conservation Board. Called an emergency meeting. 10 a.m. today. They've heard rumors about project delays. Need you there." I texted back my confirmation, then called my father. "Can you meet me at the lake this afternoon?" I asked when he answered. "There's something I need to show you." "Of course," he replied, his voice rough with sleep or emotion. I couldn't tell. "Which?" "The old boat launch. 2 o'clock. I'll be there." As I drove to the Nightingale office, I felt an unfamiliar sense of calm. The anticipation of confrontation had been replaced by something else. The anticipation of resolution, perhaps, or at least the beginning of one. The board would not be happy with what I had to propose. My father might not be either. But for the first time since receiving his call 2 days ago, I felt I was acting not from the wounded place of the girl in the garage, but from the integrated wisdom of the woman I had become. A conservationist, a mother, a daughter who had finally found her mother's voice. The Nightingale Preservation's boardroom was already full when I arrived, the tension palpable. 7 board members sat around the oak table, their expressions ranging from concern to outright displeasure. At the head of the table, Jeffrey Winters, our chairman, checked his watch pointedly as I entered. "Vanessa, thank you for joining us," he said, his tone making it clear this was not a routine meeting. "We've called this emergency session because concerning information has come to our attention regarding Lake Aurora." I set my briefcase on the table, taking the empty seat at the opposite end from Jeffrey. "What information would that be?" "That you're considering delaying or significantly altering our flagship project," said Diane Rivera, our most vocal board member. "That there are personal considerations influencing conservation decisions. That your father owns the central property in question," added Malcolm Reed, "and you never disclosed this conflict of interest." I looked around the table, noting the mix of accusation and disappointment on faces that had, until now, shown me only respect and support. These were dedicated conservationists who had believed in Nightingale's mission and my leadership. I owed them honesty. Yes, my father owns one of the properties involved in the Lake Aurora project, I confirmed. And yes, I'm considering modifications to our implementation timeline and approach. The room erupted in concerned murmurs. Jeffrey raised a hand for silence. Vanessa, you understand how this appears, he said gravely. You've directed significant organizational resources toward acquiring land around a property owned by your family. If this were to become public, the property is not owned by my family, I corrected. It's owned by my estranged father, whom I had not spoken to in a decade until 2 days ago. And the conservation value of Lake Aurora is scientifically indisputable, as our ecological assessments clearly demonstrate. Nevertheless, Diane pressed, there's a clear conflict of interest that you failed to disclose. That's true, I acknowledged. I should have recused myself from decisions specifically related to my father's property. That was an error in judgment on my part. Jeffrey leaned forward. There's more. We've received information that your father is attempting to organize opposition to our conservation efforts, that there may be a protracted legal battle ahead. I frowned. From whom did you receive this information? Jeffrey exchanged glances with Malcolm. An anonymous tip, followed by a more detailed letter from Jackson Miller. The name hit me like a physical blow. Jackson Miller, my father's former business partner, the developer who had wanted to build vacation homes around Lake Aurora 20 years ago. The man whose plans my mother had fought against. Jackson Miller has no connection to Lake Aurora anymore, I said carefully. His development company went bankrupt years ago. On the contrary, Malcolm said, sliding a folder across the table. Miller Properties has been very active recently. They've optioned several parcels just beyond our acquisition boundary, and they're claiming they have historical development rights that supersede our conservation easements. I opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. Dated just yesterday, they outlined a competing vision for Lake Aurora, a luxury eco-resort that would balance conservation with economic development. The professional proposal included architectural renderings, economic impact projections, and endorsements from local business leaders. This is a false narrative, I said, closing the folder. Miller is attempting to undermine our project because he's still bitter about his failed development plans decades ago, plans my mother successfully opposed on scientific grounds. Your mother? Diane asked, confusion evident in her voice. Catherine Lockwood was a field ecologist who documented Lake Aurora's ecosystem for years, I explained. She built the scientific case against Miller's original development. Her research is what initially inspired our current conservation efforts. This was a partial truth. While my mother's work had indeed provided the scientific foundation, I had chosen Lake Aurora specifically because of my personal connection. And yes, partly out of a desire to reclaim what had been taken from me. Regardless of the history, Jeffrey said, we have a current problem. Miller is petitioning the county to review our permits. He's claiming that your personal vendetta against your father is driving Nightingale's agenda, not legitimate conservation. Priorities. That's absurd, I protested, though the accusation contained just enough truth to sting. Is it? Malcolm asked quietly. You've never mentioned your family connection to this project in the 3 years we've been working on it. I took a deep breath, recognizing that defensiveness would only reinforce their suspicions. You're right. I should have been transparent about my personal connection to Lake Aurora from the beginning. But that connection doesn't invalidate the ecological importance of this ecosystem. I opened my briefcase and removed several folders. Copies I'd made of my mother's most compelling research. This is the scientific documentation compiled by Catherine Lockwood over 2 decades. It establishes, beyond any doubt, the critical conservation value of Lake Aurora. This is the real foundation of our project, not personal motives. As the board members passed the materials around, studying the meticulously documented species, inventories, water quality analyses, and habitat maps. I continued. Jackson Miller opposed my mother's conservation efforts 20 years ago because they interfered with his development plans. He's doing the same thing now, attempting to create a false narrative about our motives to advance his own interests. Jeffrey studied me thoughtfully. Even if that's true, there's still the matter of your father's property and your relationship to him. The appearance of impropriety. My father is dying, I said quietly. Pancreatic cancer, terminal diagnosis. The room fell silent. He came to me to ask for time, to spend his final months in his home. I'm considering a modification to our implementation timeline to accommodate this request. Not because of sentimentality, but because it's the humane thing to do and it doesn't materially harm our conservation goals. Diane's expression softened slightly. Why didn't you tell us this immediately? Because I wanted to develop a revised implementation plan first, one that would address both the ecological and human considerations. I removed another document from my briefcase. This is that plan. I distributed copies of the proposal I'd stayed up much of the night developing, a phased approach that would begin immediate restoration work on all parcels, except the central zone around my father's property, which would be addressed in a second phase after his passing. This approach actually improves our methodology by allowing us to establish baseline data on the outer parcels before addressing the critical central habitat. It's scientifically sound and compassionate. The board members studied the proposal, their expressions gradually shifting from suspicion to consideration. And what about Miller's claims? Jeffrey asked. His competing proposal. I believe there's a simple way to address that, I replied. Full transparency. We disclose my connection to the property, we make my mother's research public, and we invite independent ecological assessment to validate our conservation priorities. As the board discussed the proposal among themselves, I felt a strange mixture of regret and relief. I should have been honest from the beginning about my personal connection to Lake Aurora, but now that the truth was out, I could approach the project with integrity rather than hidden motives. There's one more thing you should know, I said, drawing their attention back to me. Last night I discovered that Jackson Miller had a personal vendetta against my mother. His development plans weren't just business, they were retribution. I pulled out one last document from my briefcase, a letter from Miller to my father dated shortly before my mother's death. Robert, I've tried reasoning with you as a business partner and as a friend. Catherine's obstruction of the Lake Aurora. Development isn't just costing us money, it's personal humiliation. She rejected me before she met you, and now she's using this environmental crusade to sabotage my career. Either you control your wife, or our partnership is finished. And so are you in this community. The board members exchanged glances as they read this damning evidence of Miller's true motivations. Where did you find this? Jeffrey asked. In my mother's research materials, which my father preserved and finally returned to me yesterday. There's a wealth of documentation showing that Miller's opposition to conservation efforts was driven by personal animus, not business considerations. Diane tapped her pen thoughtfully against the table. This casts his current opposition in a very different light. Precisely, I agreed. Miller isn't concerned about the conservation value of Lake Aurora or the integrity of our process. He's continuing a decades-old vendetta against my family. First my mother, now me. The mood in the room shifted palpably. Professional concern, giving way to protective indignation on behalf of the organization. I move that we approve Vanessa's revised implementation plan, Diane said unexpectedly, with the condition that she recuse herself from decisions specifically regarding her father's property, and that we issue a full disclosure statement about the family connection and Miller's competing interests. The motion passed unanimously. As the meeting concluded, Jeffrey lingered behind while others filed out. You should have told us from the beginning, he said, his tone gentle rather than accusatory. I know, I acknowledged. I told myself it was irrelevant, that the scientific case was what mattered. But I was also protecting myself from questions. About my motives, he nodded thoughtfully. Your mother's research is exceptional. It stands on its own merits, regardless of your personal connection to the property. He gathered his papers, then added, Take care of your family business, Vanessa. We'll handle Miller. As I left the Nightingale offices, I felt lighter somehow. The false scenario that Miller had attempted to create, painting me as vengeful and the conservation project as personal rather than ecological, had collapsed under the weight of the truth. The truth was complex, certainly. My motives had never been purely scientific, but neither had they been purely personal. I drove toward Lake Aurora for my meeting with my father, the trunk of my mother's research secure in my car. Miller's letter had revealed another layer to this story I hadn't known, that my mother's opposition to development had been cast as a personal betrayal rather than the professional ecological assessment it truly was, that my father had been caught between his business partner and his wife, facing financial ruin if he supported her conservation efforts. It didn't excuse what happened later, my exile to the garage, the years of emotional neglect. But it provided context I had never considered, a fuller picture of the pressures and conflicts that had shaped our family's disintegration. As I parked at the boat launch, I saw my father already waiting there, a frail figure standing at the water's edge. For the first time, I truly saw him, not as the monster of my childhood memories, but as a flawed, failing human being attempting, in his final months, to make what amends he could. I reached for my phone, sending a quick text to Thomas. Meeting Dad at the lake. Found something important in Mom's research about Miller. Can you join us? His reply came almost immediately. On my way. Then I stepped out of the car, facing not just my father, but the fuller truth of our shared past and the decisions that would shape our future. Both the human family I was reluctantly reconnecting with and the ecological family of Lake Aurora that had been my mother's legacy and was now mine to protect. My father turned as I approached, his hand instinctively, reaching to smooth his thinning hair, a gesture I remembered from childhood whenever he was nervous or uncertain. The afternoon sun cast a golden light across the lake, turning the water into a mirror that reflected the surrounding trees in perfect symmetry. You came, he said, relief evident in his voice. I said I would. I set my mother's research trunk on the weathered dock planks between us. I brought something you need to see. He eyed the trunk, recognition flashing across his face. Catherine's work. Yes, including a letter from Jackson Miller that explains a lot. I opened the trunk and handed him the letter we had discussed at the board meeting. Did you know about this? That his opposition to Mom's conservation efforts was personal? My father sank onto a nearby bench, reading the letter with a pained expression. I suspected, but I didn't know for certain until after she died. Jackson implied things, but nothing I could prove? He's back, I said, trying to undermine Nightingale's conservation project with the same false narrative, that it's driven by personal vendetta rather than ecological priorities. My father's head snapped up. He contacted you? Not me. Our board, trying to turn them against me by revealing our family connection and framing the entire project as my attempt at revenge. A complex emotion crossed my father's face. Anger, guilt, and something that looked surprisingly like protectiveness. That manipulative bastard. He's been waiting for an opportunity like this for years. You've stayed in touch with him? Not by choice. He moved away after your mother died and the development plans fell through. Came back about 5 years ago, bought the old Taylor property on the north side of the county. He's approached me several times about selling my land, said he was assembling investors for a new resort development. This was new information. The Taylor property borders Lake Aurora's watershed. If he's been planning a development there, it would impact the entire ecosystem, my father finished, surprising me with his grasp of the ecological implications. Catherine explained all that years ago, how water quality in the lake depends on the entire surrounding basin. I stared at him, reassessing yet again my understanding of this man. You listened to her research presentations? A faint smile touched his lips. I attended everyone. Sat in the back, didn't ask questions, but I never missed them. She was magnificent when she talked about this lake. Passionate, precise, persuasive. His smile faded. I just couldn't stand against Jackson. Not then. The business, our livelihood. But now Miller's trying to revive those development plans, I said, returning to the immediate threat. Using our family situation as leverage to discredit Nightingale's conservation work. My father stood with effort, his illness evident in the careful way he moved. Then we need to stop him. Together. Together? He met my eyes directly. You have Catherine's research, the scientific foundation. I have records of Miller's unethical business practices, documentation of corners he cut, environmental regulations he violated. I kept everything thinking someday it might be important. Why didn't you use it before? I asked. When Mom was fighting him? His gaze dropped to the worn planks of the dock. Because I was complicit in some of it. We were partners. His shady dealings benefited me too. He looked back up, steady now. But that doesn't matter anymore. I'm dying. Miller can't hurt me, now. But he can still hurt the lake. And you. The significance of what he was offering registered fully. My father was willing to incriminate himself, to tarnish his business reputation in his final months, to protect both the lake and me. It was perhaps the first truly selfless act I'd witnessed from him since my childhood. Before I could respond, the sound of gravel crunching announced another arrival. Thomas emerged from the tree line, slightly out of breath as if he'd hurried. Sorry, I'm late, he said, joining us on the dock. What's this about Miller? As my father explained the situation, I found myself watching them together, the dying man and his son, the golden child who had received all the attention I had been denied. But instead of the familiar resentment, I felt something unexpected. Empathy. Thomas had received a different kind of burden, the weight of being the favored one, the responsibility of meeting expectations I had been freed from by my very exclusion. My phone buzzed. A message from Elena. Board called. Miller showed up at their offices, demanding to meet with you. What do you want me to do? I showed the message to my father and Thomas. He's forcing a confrontation. My father's expression hardened with resolve. Let him. It's time he faced both of us. All three of us, Thomas corrected, his stance subtly shifting to one of solidarity beside me. In that moment, standing on the dock with the family I had fled and the lake I had returned to save, I felt a shift in the power dynamics that had defined my life. No longer was I the exiled daughter seeking revenge. I was a conservationist armed with scientific evidence, family testimony, and the moral authority of truth. Tell Elena to set up the meeting, I told my father and brother. Tomorrow morning, we'll end this once and for all. The Nightingale conference room felt too small for the tension it contained. Jackson Miller sat at one end of the table, expensively, dressed and exuding confidence despite the unexpectedness of my father's presence. Jeffrey and Diane represented the board, their expressions professionally neutral. Elena stood by the presentation screen, ready to display the evidence we had. Assembled overnight. This is highly irregular, Miller said, eyeing my father and Thomas with barely concealed irritation. I was expecting a private conversation with the board about Ms. Lockwood's conflict of interest. There's nothing irregular about family members. Attending a meeting about family property, I replied calmly. Especially when those family members have relevant information about your true motivations, Mr. Miller. His smile didn't reach his eyes. My motivations are simple. Ensuring that conservation decisions are made on scientific merit, not personal vendettas. Your failure to disclose your relationship to the central property owner represents a serious ethical breach. I've already addressed that issue with my board, I countered. What I find interesting is your sudden concern for Lake Aurora after 20 years of absence. Miller leaned back, affecting casualness. The ecological value of the lake has only recently been fully documented. As a responsible developer, I'm proposing a balanced approach that preserves critical habitat while allowing sustainable recreational access. My father made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a cough. Come off it, Jackson. You've never cared about ecological value a day in your life. Miller's expression hardened. Robert, you're looking unwell. Perhaps this meeting is too taxing for someone in your condition. The casual cruelty of the remark sent a ripple of discomfort through the room. Even Jeffrey, who had been maintaining professional distance, frowned at Miller's tone. My health is irrelevant, my father replied evenly. What matters is that you're using the same playbook you did 20 years ago, undermining legitimate conservation efforts for personal gain and vendetta. Vendetta? Miller laughed dismissively. That's a strong word for a simple business disagreement. Is it? I nodded to Elena, who displayed the letter from Miller to my father on the screen. This doesn't read like a business disagreement to me. It reads like a man resentful that my mother rejected him romantically and then professionally. Miller's face flushed as his own words appeared enlarged before the group. Catherine's obstruction of the Lake Aurora development isn't just costing us money, it's personal humiliation. She rejected me before she met you, and now she's using this environmental crusade to sabotage my career. The room fell silent as everyone read the damning evidence. Ancient history, Miller said finally, his voice tight. Taken out of context. There's more context, Thomas said, speaking for the first time. Dad kept detailed records of your partnership, including documentation of environmental regulations you violated in previous developments. Elena advanced to the next slide, copies of internal memos detailing contaminated soil that had been illegally disposed of, wetlands filled without permits, water quality reports that had been falsified. Miller's confident demeanor cracked slightly. Those are unsubstantiated allegations from decades ago. The statute of limitations may have expired for legal prosecution, I interjected, but not for ethical judgment. The board isn't deciding whether to press charges. They're deciding whose assessment of Lake Aurora's value to trust, yours or Nightingale's. Jeffrey leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Miller. Mr. Miller, when you approached us with concerns about Ms. Lockwood's objectivity, you presented yourself as motivated solely by conservation best practices. This evidence suggests otherwise. This is a coordinated attack, Miller protested, his voice rising. They're trying to destroy my reputation to advance their own agenda. An interesting accusation, Diane observed. Considering that's exactly what you attempted to do to Ms. Lockwood. Miller turned to me, anger replacing his professional mask. You think you've won? That lake has been my focus for 20 years. I've waited, planned, assembled investors. Your little conservation group doesn't have the resources to fight me. If I contest every permit, challenge every assessment. It was the admission we had been waiting for, confirmation that his sudden interest in balanced development was merely a continuation of a decades-long obsession. The board members exchanged significant glances. Actually, my father said quietly, she does have the resources. He nodded to Elena, who displayed the final document, my mother's will, recently discovered among her research papers. My wife left her entire inheritance to 2 beneficiaries, my father explained. Half to our daughter for her education and future security. The other half to establish a trust for Lake Aurora's protection, to be activated when Vanessa completed. Her environmental science education. I stared at him, stunned. What inheritance? You never told me. Catherine's family had old money, my father said, his gaze not leaving Miller's increasingly pale face. Not vast wealth, but substantial. After she died, I couldn't bear to tell you about it. It seemed like blood money somehow. So I invested it, growing both portions. The trust now contains over $3 million, specifically designated for legal defense of Lake Aurora against development threats. The revelation left me speechless. All these years, I had struggled financially, worked multiple jobs to put myself through college, scrimped to launch Nightingale, while a substantial inheritance had been waiting, unknown to me. You kept this from me? I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. One more failing among many, my father acknowledged, genuine regret in his eyes. But the trust is legally yours to control now, and just in time, it seems. Miller stood abruptly, gathering his papers. This meeting is over. You'll be hearing from my attorneys. As he stormed out, the weight of everything I had just learned settled over me. Not just the inheritance that had been withheld, but the realization that my mother had foreseen this fight and prepared for it, arming me for a battle she wouldn't live to witness. Jeffrey broke the stunned silence. Well, that was unexpected. Welcome to my family, I said softly, still processing the magnitude of the revelation. We specialize in the unexpected. After the meeting, my father asked if we could speak privately. We sat in my small office, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the awards and certificates on the wall. Achievements earned through years of determination and sacrifice I now knew could have been easier. Why? I asked simply. Why keep the inheritance from me? He looked down at his hands, liver spots prominent against pale skin. At first, it was grief. I couldn't bear to discuss anything related to Catherine's arrangements. Then, after I remarried, Karen had opinions about the money. She didn't want me to have it, I guessed. She wanted it for her son. He met my eyes directly. I refused. That was the beginning of the end for us, though it took years to finally break. But by then, patterns were established. You were in the garage, communication was broken, and shame kept me silent. And what about my mother's conservation trust? Did you tell anyone about that? No one except the attorney who managed it. I honored that part of her will absolutely. Never touched a penny of it. It's been growing, waiting for you to claim it. He paused. Catherine knew you'd follow in her footsteps. She saw it in you, even when you were small. I tried to reconcile this information with the narrative I'd constructed over the years. The father who didn't care, who had exiled and forgotten me. The truth was more complicated, as truths usually are. All those years I struggled, I said, my voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath. Working nights to pay for school, taking on debt, wondering if I'd ever have enough to start Nightingale. I know. His voice was barely audible. I tracked your progress from afar, clipped newspaper articles when you graduated, followed your early conservation projects online, but you never reached out, never offered help. No. That's one more failing I can't excuse or explain, except to say that the longer the silence stretched, the more impossible it seemed to break it. He pushed a thick file folder across my desk. This is everything. The trust documents. The investment records. The accumulated interest. It's all yours now, to use as you see fit. I stared at the folder, the physical manifestation of both inheritance and revelation. There's more you haven't told me, isn't there? He nodded slowly. Much more about your mother, about our marriage, about what went wrong after she died. He glanced at his watch. But I have a treatment appointment in an hour. Another time? The question held more weight than its simple words conveyed. Another time meant a future, meetings, conversations, a relationship of sorts, rebuilt in whatever time he had left. Yes, I said after a moment. Another time. As I watched him leave, moving carefully with the deliberate pace of the seriously ill, I opened the folder. Inside was not only the trust documentation and financial records, but a handwritten letter from my mother, addressed to me, dated 2 weeks before her death. My dearest Vanessa, if you're reading this, you found your way back to Lake Aurora, just as I always knew you would. The lake is in your blood, as it was in mine. Protect it, cherish it. But remember, it's not just the ecosystem that needs healing. It's the people connected to it, including your father, who loves deeply but expresses it poorly, and who will need your forgiveness someday. All my love, Mom 20 years later. Her words bridged time and loss. A full disclosure from beyond that asked me to consider a fuller truth than the one I had clung to for so long. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. With my mother's conservation trust now activated, Nightingale had the resources to vigorously defend the Lake Aurora project against Miller's legal challenges. Our attorneys filed preemptive motions, documenting his pattern of harassment and conflicts of interest. The local press, initially intrigued by Miller's accusations, quickly shifted their narrative when presented with evidence of his past environmental violations. Meanwhile, I faced a more personal challenge: redefining boundaries. With my father and brother, after years of complete separation, I now found myself in regular contact with both. My father's cancer treatments left him weaker each week, yet he insisted on meeting whenever his strength allowed, gradually filling in the gaps of our family history. Thomas and I developed a cautious rapport, built initially around pragmatic matters, coordinating our father's medical appointments, discussing the house's maintenance, but gradually expanding to include memories of our mother, comparisons of our separate childhoods, tentative steps toward understanding. Through it all, the question of what would happen to my father's property after his death loomed unspoken. The Lake Aurora Conservation Plan had been modified to work around his land during his lifetime, but the long-term vision still required that critical central parcel. Elena and I were reviewing restoration timelines in my office when my father called, his voice weaker than I'd heard it before. "Can you come to the house? I need to discuss something important." An hour later, I sat in the living room I had rarely been allowed to enter as a teenager, now transformed into a makeshift bedroom to accommodate my father's declining mobility. Thomas sat nearby, his expression suggesting he already knew what was coming. "I've updated my will," my father said without preamble. "The house and property will be divided equally between you two." I frowned. "Dad, you know that complicates the conservation plan. That parcel needs—" He raised a hand to stop me. "Let me finish. I've added specific language directing that upon my death, the property be donated to Nightingale Preservations with 2 conditions." Thomas handed me a document, the updated will with the conditions highlighted. A permanent educational center be established on the property, named for Catherine Lockwood. My children retain lifetime access to the lake and shoreline for personal, non-commercial use. I read it twice, looking for hidden complications, but found none. It was elegantly simple, honoring my mother's legacy, ensuring family connection to the lake would continue, while placing the land under Nightingale's protection permanently. "You've thought this through," I said, surprised. "Had plenty of time for thinking lately," he replied, a hint of his old dry humor showing through. "It's the right solution. Catherine would approve." The boundary he had drawn was clear, acknowledging both the ecological imperatives and the human connections to this place. It wasn't a compromise that weakened either, but a synthesis that strengthened both. "What do you think?" Thomas asked, watching me carefully. I considered all that had transpired since that unexpected phone call weeks ago. The garage still stood, a reminder of pain that couldn't be erased. But its meaning had transformed. No longer a symbol of rejection and exile, but a complex marker of a flawed family's journey towards something like healing. "I think it works," I said finally. "For the lake. For all of us." My father nodded, relief evident in his tired eyes. Then it settled. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. Some boundaries needed to remain firm, protection against the repetition of old patterns. But it was acceptance of a more nuanced truth than the one I had built my life around. And perhaps in time, that acceptance might grow into something more. As Thomas and I left the house later, he paused at the garage. "What do you want to do with this place?" After I studied the structure that had shaped so much of my life, for better and worse. Turn it into something new, something that serves the lake. "Mom would like that," he said softly. "Yes," I agreed. She would. 3 weeks after our meeting about the will, a certified letter arrived at my office. Miller's Development Company had filed a lawsuit challenging Nightingale's permits and conservation easements, alleging procedural irregularities and claiming historical development rights dating back to agreements with my grandfather. "This is desperate," Elena said when I called her to the house to discuss it. We sat on the back porch, watching Ethan and Zoe play by the small stream that ran through my modest backyard. "He's throwing everything at the wall, hoping something sticks." "It's also expensive," I noted, sliding the lawsuit across the table. "He's hired 3 separate law firms specializing in environmental, property, and contract law." Elena scanned the document, her expression darkening. "He's going after the trust, too, claiming Catherine wasn't of sound mind when she established it. My mother was completely lucid until the day she died," I said sharply. "He knows that." "He's not looking for legal victory," Elena pointed out. "He's trying to drain the trust through prolonged litigation, force you to spend the protection funds on legal defense instead of conservation work." "Is this about the lake property? Or is it just revenge now?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Both, probably. He couldn't beat your mother, and now he's determined not to let her daughter succeed where he failed." Elena's hand covered mine briefly. "How's your father taking this?" "Not well. His health is declining faster than expected. The stress isn't helping." Before Elena could respond, my phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Found something important in Dad's old business files. Meeting you at the office tomorrow?" The following morning, Thomas arrived at Nightingale with a weathered leather portfolio. "Dad kept everything," he explained, spreading documents across my desk, including Miller's original development plans from 20 years ago. I examined the yellowed papers, noting the property boundaries marked in red. "These extend beyond Lake Aurora, into the neighboring watersheds." Thomas nodded grimly. "Miller never just wanted our lake. He was planning a regional resort complex encompassing 3 different water systems. Lake Aurora was just phase 1. That's why Mom fought. So hard, I realized. She saw the bigger threat." "There's more." He pointed to survey markers on the old maps. "See these notations? They indicate test drilling for groundwater contamination assessment. Dad saved the results. The test results, attached with faded paper clips, showed significant toxic contamination on multiple sites that would have been part of Miller's development. He knew the land was contaminated," I said slowly, "and developed plans anyway, without disclosure or remediation plans." "Criminal, negligence at minimum," Thomas agreed. "Enough to permanently discredit him with investors and regulators." As we organized these damning materials, another text arrived from our father. "Miller stopped by the house, threatening consequences if we don't drop the trust fight. Time to end this." The resistance phase of Miller's campaign was escalating from legal to something more personal. But he hadn't counted on facing a united front. The combined resources of Catherine's research, Robert's business records, and the determination of both her children to protect her legacy. 6 months after my father's unexpected phone call, Lake Aurora sparkled under autumn sunlight as Nightingale Preservations held the official dedication ceremony for the Catherine Lockwood Ecological Research Center. A wooden platform had been constructed at the old boat launch, providing seating for the small crowd of conservationists, local officials, and community members who had gathered to witness this milestone. My father sat in the front row, oxygen, tank beside him, Thomas on one side and my children on the other. Despite his doctor's concerns, he had insisted on attending, determined to see this day. Elena stood nearby, no longer just Nightingale's scientific advisor, but someone who had cautiously re-entered my personal life in recent months. As I approached the podium, I touched the small blue stone pendant around my neck, a gift from my mother that Thomas had found among her belongings and given to me last week. Its weight against my collarbone anchored me to this moment, to the journey that had brought me here. Lake Aurora has been a sacred place for my family for generations, I began, looking out over the water that had shaped me in ways I was only beginning to understand. Today, we ensure it remains protected for generations to come, not just as a pristine ecosystem, but as a living laboratory where we can study and learn from nature's wisdom. I spoke briefly about the center's mission, about the permanent conservation easements now in place, about the victory against Miller's development plans when his investors had abandoned him after learning of the contamination issues. But the heart of my message was more personal. My mother saw this lake as more than water and trees and wildlife. She saw it as a relationship between people and place, one that required tending, understanding, and sometimes forgiveness. The garage that once stood on this property has been removed. In its place, we're building an education pavilion where children will learn about ecosystems, interconnection, and restoration. I glanced at my father, whose eyes held a complex mix of pride, regret, and peace. Some wounds can't be undone. Some memories won't fade, but we can choose what to build in their place. After the ceremony, as attendees mingled and explored the property, I found a quiet moment alone at the water's edge. The garage was gone now, its concrete foundation broken, up and repurposed as stepping stones leading to the new pavilion. The painful past it represented hadn't been erased or denied, but integrated and transformed. The future held challenges: my father's declining health, the ongoing work of conservation, the careful navigation of newfound family connections. But, for the first time since childhood, I felt fully present in my own story, no longer defined primarily by wounds and grievances. This wasn't a fairy tale ending with perfect forgiveness or complete healing. It was something more honest, the acknowledgement that damage had been done that couldn't be undone, alongside the choice to create something meaningful from that truth. As my children ran laughing along the shoreline, collecting colorful leaves, I recognized the most profound liberation. I was no longer the girl from the garage, shaped entirely by rejection. I was Vanessa Lockwood, conservationist, mother, daughter, a complex woman standing firmly in her own power, protecting what she loved not from spite or vengeance, but from authentic commitment to something larger than herself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.